Hey everyone, and welcome back to the One Church podcast. I am joined today by renowned author and pastor, Mike Williams.
Hi, good to be with you.
You doing all right, Mike?
Doing really well, thank you.
I feel like you and I could spend the whole of this time just talking about film and movies, and maybe we'll make one day where we just see anything good recently?
Well, actually, you've put me on the spot. What have I seen? I'm really actually watching what my wife wants me to watch at the moment, which is Married at First Sight. It's not a movie.
I wondered why you hesitated there.
But it makes her happy for us to watch that together.
Okay, we'll do another one of these then. We'll unpack that, Married at First Sight, pros, cons, all of the above. But today, we want to focus on a wonderful topic, pain.
Correct, yes.
Can we talk about that?
We can talk about that.
So you've actually written quite extensively recently on this topic. What interests you, Mike, about pain? Why are you writing about it?
Yeah, well, I guess that's a really good question. It's not a cheery subject.
Yeah.
However, it is something I think that we all have in common. So the human race, on one level, experiences pain. If not right now, we have a concern that one day we will experience pain. We all suffer to some degree, whether that be grief or physical suffering or suffering for our values and beliefs. So it's a subject that affects us all. Right. And Christianity has something to say to that. And I think it's really important to grasp what it says. Yeah,
sure. Okay, now, you and I, we were a part of the same church, One Church, which is a Pentecostal church. So for any listening, like, you can just explain, okay, what does that mean to be part of a Pentecostal church within the faith of Christianity? And then second, how does the Pentecostal church kind of interact with pain? Is it a common topic that's spoken about regularly? What's a Pentecostal view of the pain? I think, as you well put, we all experience it, we all go through it. What's the Pentecostal stance on it?
Yeah, sure. Well, Pentecostalism is a movement within evangelical Christianity that's around about 120 years or so old now. It's a movement that really believe that the gifts of the Spirit, as spoken about in the New Testament, are still in operation today. You can encounter God powerfully and dynamically and transformatively today, just as we see in the stories of the Gospels. So we don't believe those are just stories that are confined to history, but can be present experiences today.
Yeah.
And so what you see in the ministry of Jesus, particularly, is him moving from town to town, relieving suffering, ministering to people. And so you would see healings of an extraordinary type and scale in the ministry of Jesus. You'd see that continue then in the ministry of the apostles who followed Jesus and established the early church. There was certainly an emphasis on relieving suffering. And so at some level, Pentecostals believe that is our ministry, and our focus today is to go into the world and transform it through the power of God's Spirit, which we will see as a result the relief of many kinds of sicknesses and diseases and all kinds of suffering.
Yeah.
So if that gives you kind of a picture of what Pentecostals are about, that's our DNA. Our DNA, if our identity is, hey, you can encounter God, and in that encounter be transformed. Sure. And that is not just a spiritual transformation or a mental transformation, but you can be physically transformed in encounters with God.
Okay.
So we're taught to expect that as a common occurrence in the church.
Yeah, so it's not uncommon for people to pray for healing. Sure. If someone has a physical illness, lay hands on that person, pray for them. And this really takes me to maybe what could be the point of contention, I think, when it comes to believing that there is a God, believing that God is good, loves people, loves us, having that as a belief or reality, but then also the presence of pain in the world, personal, on a human level. You don't have to look at the news long to look and think that's not right, or that's a horrific circumstance or situation. There's pain left, right, and centre just on our timelines that we're scrolling through. How do you square that? Like, I know that can be termed as the problem of pain, and people will often use that to say how there can't be an all-powerful, all-loving God if there is pain. What would you say to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, the way I would view it is, look, you do have this problem of pain. How can a loving and a good God allow pain to exist in the world and suffering to exist in the world? It's a good question. But I also want to say that if you didn't have that question, you'd have another question, which would be, how can a loving and good God not allow us to have free will? So you've got to have one or the other. You can't have both. And so God elected in his wisdom to create a world of human beings who could have the freedom to choose their destiny, to have free will, to be able to make choices. He didn't make us as robots that would automatically operate in a way that was morally perfect. He gave us the opportunity to choose how we live. And the story of human history is that we've often used that choice and that free will to act malevolently, selfishly, and to bring upon ourselves the consequences of those decisions, resulting in a world that experiences pain and suffering. Now, God gave us that free will, and I'd argue that is a good thing to have free will. Because if you didn't have free will, you wouldn't experience love, for example.
Right.
You can't enter into a genuinely loving and trusting relationship if you are robotic in your choice making. Mm-hmm. But free will gives us the ability to enjoy good and to enjoy love. And so I think that was on the whole, the better decision, but it creates a space for us to choose the wrong things also.
Yeah.
So how could a good and loving God allow pain? Well, the second part of that answer is that he has entered into our broken world of suffering and suffered with us, to identify with us, to show his love and compassion and kindness to us. And furthermore, he has promised a day is coming when the earth and humanity will be restored to a place where there is no more suffering and there are no more tears and there is no more pain. And so God has got a plan. The plan will involve the removal of suffering. But right now we live in between. We have free will. We live in a broken world. And we are to trust in God and to bring God's message of hope and reconciliation that will ultimately lead to the restoration of everything.
Wow. So let me circle back to the Pentecostal perspective on this then. So if it's quite common for us to see the love of God, to believe that God is still active, he didn't just make existence, then he's off somewhere, but he is interested in our day-to-day, he's interested in the good things and the bad, and would want to intercede on our behalf in way of answering prayer. What happens when that doesn't work? So I'm a Pentecostal believer, I'm believing that God wants to move, I'm ill or a family member's ill, and I pray for them, believing, and it doesn't change anything. The pain is still there, the suffering's still there, the circumstance hasn't changed. That causes some difficulty, right? You and I would have both experienced that too.
Right.
That feeling of I thought this was going to happen, but it didn't.
Yeah.
Can you speak into that?
Yeah, so broadly within Christianity, there's kind of like a tension. At one end of the extreme, God is almost kind of just inactive, just not getting involved in all the details and stuff of life. And at the other end of the scale, God has promised to heal every illness that we'll ever have, and so there's a sense of imminence. And imagine that as a scale. Pentecostals would definitely lean more towards the end of the scale, that you can encounter God every day, you can experience his presence, you can receive the benefits of being in a relationship with him, you can be forgiven, you can be healed on a daily basis. So you can essentially live in an imminent expectation that God is transforming and moving all of the time. The problem with that is that, as you've just described, when I pray and when I am suffering or when I'm in pain, and I have that expectation, that belief that God is imminent and moving and transforming all of the time, but yet for some reason doesn't answer that prayer, or doesn't move in the way that I hope he would move, or in a way that I need him to move, it then can create a crisis of faith. It can create a sort of confusion, really. And God, why aren't you answering this prayer? Why aren't you transforming me? Or you may see the person in the next row from you at church who prayed the same prayer and did receive,
got an answer.
did receive a healing, or did receive, and you can wonder why is God not displaying equity within the church if some are healed and others aren't healed? And that can create this crisis of faith. And particularly within Pentecostalism, you notice this because we have such a drive and a DNA, a kind of identity really, is that there is, you can meet God and be transformed by God. So when you're not, it does create an inherent discomfort within Pentecostalism.
Yeah.
That the things we say and the things we teach are not always the things we experience.
Right.
And that inherent discomfort within Pentecostalism is the reason I picked up on this particular subject and decided to do some more work on it and write about it, because I wanted to understand, well, what do I say?
Yeah.
And how do I counsel and how do I pray for people
Yeah.
in a way that isn't insensitive
Yeah.
and raises expectations too high,
Yeah.
but also has faith in God, who I believe can transform us and can heal and can do great things.
Wow. Yeah.
That is a real tension that we have to live with as Christians.
Yeah. And tension and discomfort, I think those are two of the right words to describe that feeling of being there, of believing one thing, maybe experiencing another. What would you say then to help someone? And you touched on it because your heart is almost pastoral. How can I help people who are experiencing that discomfort? How can you? What can you do to bring words of counsel and comfort to someone?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd do is I'd go to the Bible, and particularly I found very helpful reading the life and experiences of the Apostle Paul.
Okay.
So the Apostle Paul has given us a number of letters in the New Testament where he speaks about his own sufferings a lot.
Yeah.
He speaks about the expectation of suffering. He speaks about, in particular, there are two real motifs or themes that keep recurring in his letters. The first one is what we call participation in suffering, and the second one is purpose in suffering.
Okay.
So participation is this. Paul speaks a lot about how we're to view our sufferings not as something always to be vanquished, like every pain equates to evil that needs to be overcome. But Paul writes about it as identifying with the life of Jesus Christ, who suffered and who died and who rose again. And in a sense, what Paul is saying to the church is, look, expect to live lives like the Master. Right. Expect to follow him and identify with him. When you suffer, is a privilege because you're identifying with the life and experiences and the model that Jesus Christ has set for us. So suffering isn't, in Paul's view of the world, something that cannot be redeemed. It's something that's actually very useful. And if you view it that way, as an identification with Christ, suffering takes on a great privilege and a great sense of meaning, really, that can help us psychologically to cope with perhaps the painful effects of that suffering. Yeah. The purpose recurring theme, the theme of purpose, is that Paul sees there's great purpose in suffering too. So just as you cannot develop muscles without putting them under pressure, Paul would say you can't develop a godly character without putting that character under some degree of pressure. And suffering has a real purifying, strengthening effect on our spiritual lives. Oh. So Paul would say, for example, if you've never been stressed, you'll never learn patience. You know, if you've never been angry and struggled with that, and struggled with the effect of people's sin on your life, you'll never learn forgiveness. And so there's a sense in which there is purpose in the chaos that sometimes we want to escape. But Paul would say, there's something you can learn in that. There's something you can develop in that. That's actually really a good thing. Yeah. So this idea of participating with Christ and finding the purpose in suffering, you find that language lots in the letters of Paul. Yeah. But what Pentecostals want to do is focus on narratives of deliverance and escape. Okay. God can deliver you from this so that it's no longer a problem and he can do it today. Yeah. And Pentecostals will emphasize the narratives that give us that kind of hope. Yeah. Whereas I think Paul says, hang on a minute. Yeah. That may not be God's ultimate purpose for your life. Yeah. He may want to do something in the journey of suffering that is of more value than of me delivering you in the next moment. Wow. So many great things there. There's a lot in there, but brilliant. And the
the nuance and the depth of when I'm in suffering, to participate with Christ, or the purpose of my suffering is that's deep. And oftentimes it's only retrospectively that we can look back at moments of difficulty in our life and see the good that came from them, and where we are today is because of the things that we have been through, both good and bad in our lives. And it's not always easy to spot that in the moment, or not always easy to look ahead and trust God that there is something good that's going to come out of this, that he works all things together for the good of those that love him according to his purpose, according to his purposes. How do you tell the difference, though? Because how do you tell the difference between a time where deliverance is needed, where an answer to prayer is needed, where breakthrough is needed, and I should be praying that way and believing for a miracle in the moment, versus staying in the tension of the moment and prayerfully kind of accepting what's happening? How do you tell the difference? Because you talk about the Apostle Paul, there were times in his life where he was delivered. You think of Paul and Silas in the prison, there was an immediacy to that miracle that happened. How do you judge that deliverance versus patience?
Sure. Well, there's a great scholar by the name of William Menzies, who's quite a famous Pentecostal scholar, and in his approach to this subject, he says, I'm paraphrasing him now, but he says something along the lines of, we should pray to that end, pray for delivery, pray that God heals, pray for the relief of suffering, until such a point as either we receive that answer, or we hear the Spirit whispering to us that something bigger is at play. Okay. There's a grander purpose here. Yeah. So, for example, there's an example of that in the Apostle Paul himself experiences what he describes as the thorn in the flesh. So the very analogy describes something that's physical and painful. Yeah. So some scholars have said perhaps Paul was experiencing a disability that was having a limiting effect on his ministry. There are other views on that as well, but I think that's a fairly good argument. So Paul's approach was to pray. Remove the thorn. Yeah. Take this thing away. Yeah. And it says I prayed on 3 occasions. So he kept praying to remove this suffering that he was experiencing until he heard a whisper. He heard the Spirit speak. And the Spirit said to him, there's a purpose in experiencing this thorn in the flesh, to keep him from the pride, because of all of the revelation that he had received from God. And as soon as he had that answer, his whole view of this thorn in the flesh changed. It became to him a matter of pride. It became to him a matter of trusting and relying on God. That became, in his view, a participation in his master's suffering. Yeah. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said it another way. He said, no disciple should see himself as being above his master. In other words, if Christ suffered, expect to suffer. Yeah. Don't just expect the benefits of the master, but expect to live as the master lived. Yeah. We see in the Bible, in the Lucan corpus, that's the book of Luke and Acts, Jesus is suffering, but then later on we see the disciples are suffering. So why should we expect today to experience any less? Yeah. So I go back to say, pray. Pray for the deliverance. Pray for healing. Yeah. Believe God, because he can transform, and he is good, and he will bless you. Yeah. But that transformation that you're asking for may sometimes be different to what you're praying for. Yeah. So in Paul's case, he wasn't transformed physically, but his perspective was entirely transformed.
Wow. Do you think that in our society and culture, we have lost sight of eternity? And what I mean by that, and how that links to this subject, is if this life is all we've got, then the objective of it should be to enjoy it as much as we can and to rid ourselves of as much pain as we possibly can. What do you think eternity's impact has on our view and what we prioritize as a valuable life, and what matters and what constitutes as a good life versus a bad life?
Yeah, I think eternity should have a massive impact on the way that we view life. It gives us an incredible hope for a beginning. So any suffering that we will experience in this life is by comparative to eternity, is going to be very short. That immediately helps us say, okay, can I spend the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years in the potential place of weakness or suffering, because I know that at the end of this race, I know that I will receive an eternal body that will not suffer. So it helps us. It gives us a hope. It gives us something to aim for. It gives us a target.
Yeah.
It gives us something that can, even on the really difficult days, there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
So I think eternity helps us in that way. I think it also teaches us that, I can live selflessly and I can live for others now.
Yeah.
Whereas if you don't have an eternal perspective, you will instinctively live for you.
Yeah.
So the eternal perspective is probably one of the greatest gifts that God has given us as Christians in the world, and can give us a proper context for understanding suffering and dealing with the psychological impact of suffering. All the while trusting and believing that God can step in, even now, to the next few years and make a big difference in our lives.
Yeah, brilliant. Now, let's just speak then, and we perhaps might finish with these ideas. Let's speak to the person that maybe is experiencing pain and suffering, or knows someone that is, believes in God, believes that God can heal. How should we pray? How should we believe? What should we hope for? What would you advise that person to do? And I appreciate that's a broad question, because suffering takes on, that can mean lots of different things, can't it? From difficulty in the job to physical pain. I know that's a broad thing to speak into, but what would you advise a person?
Again, I just looked at the prayers that the Apostle Paul prayed, and I think they're really instructive to us. So Paul prayed, and as just give you kind of like a general overview, his prayers included gratefulness, thankfulness. I think wherever we are in life and whatever we're going through, keeping a grateful attitude and a heart of thankfulness to God for the valuable benefits that he has given us is a great place to start. I think the Apostle Paul included within his prayers a sense of realism, of earthy realism.
Okay.
He would pray for the afflictions and the persecutions and the struggles that the church were experiencing and that he was experiencing. But he also finished his prayers often with a kind of what we would call an eschatological focus, which is essentially looking at the end of the race and saying, look, victory is coming, triumph is coming, the end is coming, and it's good.
Yeah.
So there was a sense in which Paul was both victorious and realistic in his prayer life. And he also wasn't afraid to pray for miracles. He wasn't afraid to lay hands on people and ask God to do miracles. And so as a Christian, I can do all of those things. I can be grateful. I can pray for miracles. I can pray for patience. I can pray for strength. I can pray for grace in time of need. But I can also pray for the victory to dominate the way that I view my future.
Yeah.
And I don't think in any of those things we're being faithless. There are some people that would say that if we don't claim the promises of God for our lives, if we say the wrong things when we pray, we could lose our miracles. We could lose our... I just find that really sets a bar that's far higher than the bar that the Apostle Paul set, that Jesus set. I think Jesus taught us how to pray as well, when he said, seek the will of God, your will be done as on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses. Jesus wasn't faithless in praying those things. He was bringing his life under the will of God and trusting God for our provision, for our protection, for everything that we need. Yeah. And so I would say, learn from the way that Jesus prayed, learn from the way that the Apostle Paul prayed, and you won't go far wrong. Yeah,
wonderful advice. And broader than prayer, so I think that's fantastic. That really informs how we could pray in the face of some difficulties and pain and suffering. What other advice, maybe pastorally, what other advice would you give to someone that's going through a difficult time, going through a time of pain and suffering? Pray, yes, in the way that we've just described. Anything else that you would advise they do?
Again, the Apostle Paul would say, be patient in affliction.
Yeah.
Be patient in affliction. I think that is quite instructive. It's quite instructive to counsel people to keep their eyes fixed on Jesus, to trust him. I think it's good to counsel people to lean into prayer and to believe God for the breakthrough, to continue to cultivate a grateful, worshipping heart, and to not allow the lies on the discouragement of our suffering to kind of dominate our perspective on the future, but to have that victorious outlook.
Yeah.
If God is going to deal with this either today, tomorrow, it could be in 50 years' time, but He's dealing with this.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna trust Him until that day comes.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. And I guess to not do that alone as well.
Exactly.
See, even Jesus saying, "Give us today our daily bread," there speaks of a community emphasis there, doesn't it? That suggests, I'm not saying give me today my daily bread, that I'm going to go through this alone, pray this alone, be patient alone, but find people around to help me journey this thing through.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know that I think Paul said in Corinthians that God's desire is for comfort to abound in the church. Those are the words he uses. So how can comfort abound in the church if there's nothing to comfort?
Yeah.
If everyone's delivered every day of everything.
You don't need it.
You can't.
Yeah.
So that's clearly an extreme.
Yeah.
But we will suffer. We will go through difficulties. But God, through His Spirit, wants to bring comfort to the church through the church. So you can comfort others as you have been comforted in Christ. And that's God's will for us in Jesus.
Yeah.
That comfort would abound in the church.
Yeah.
Think of it another way. How will we reach the world if we're all delivered instantly of every sickness? Well, there'll be no Christians in the cancer wards to witness to the other cancer patients about the hope they have in Jesus. If we empty all the hospitals of Christians, who is there to bring the message of Jesus there? Who is there to bring the comfort of Jesus to people that are struggling if they've never suffered themselves? There's something about suffering in our lives that God is using to reach the world.
Wow.
The Apostle Paul didn't reach his world because of his wealth and his health. He reached the world because of his weakness and his suffering and his reliance on God. Why should we expect it to be any different today?
Yeah.
So Pentecostals believe that God can do miracles, but believe that God is also doing something extraordinary beyond our comprehension, even in the suffering.
Yeah.
And trust Him with that. And I think that's a good way forwards.
Yeah. And again, placing our eyes on Jesus and on the broader picture there, it cultivates hope in us, I think, to endure, to carry on, to keep our eyes on what God wants us to do and the people He's calling us to reach. So, Mike, thank you so much. Last question, do you have any books, podcasts, recommendations for people to dive into this a little bit more if they wanted to?
Yeah, there's a great book by a guy called Michael Gorman called Cruciformity.
I thought you were going to say Michael Williams then. Yeah, called Dying to Get There.
Well, you can read my book as well, available on Amazon,
Go on.
Dying to Get There. But there's also a book by Michael Gorman called Cruciformity that really nails down this idea of participating with Christ, particularly in suffering. That is very helpful and I think is a useful place to start.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for your time and all your research that you've done into this topic. Hope you've found it valuable. I know I have. And we will catch you the next time.